Oh, would you look at this?
Yeah, well...
Would you look at that?
Yeah, there's a...
You know, when I see a car like this, first thing I do is I say, would you look at this? You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
If you're watching this video, there's a strong possibility you just may be childish. At least that's what Mazda seems to think. The MazdaSpeed 3 at its core was pure performance, but it had to go. What's up guys, my name is Chris and welcome to the Breakdown, where we talk about everything cars news and reviews. If you are new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, welcome back. So just last week I asked you guys which one you wanted to see first in regards to sedans that were a bit ahead of their time or we just stopped caring about, and the one that won out was the MazdaSpeed 3. Of course, MazdaSpeed has been a part of the legacy of Mazda for a very long time and has continued to bring the pedigree of performance alongside many other of their mass market models. But the thing is we're not talking about Mazda as a whole. We're talking about the MazdaSpeed 3. The MazdaSpeed 3 was a torque monster and was kind of ahead of its time because of the performance, but also the value package that it offered. Howsoever, as Mazda began to grow as a company and began to separate and part ways from Ford, MazdaSpeed 3 unfortunately had to go. And in this video, we are going to talk about it and why this is such an important move for Mazda. So with that being said, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching The Breakdown. So I won't give you guys too much historical context, but getting into it, but MazdaSpeed originally began as Mazda Sports Corner, which was supposed to be kind of like a Ford SVT style situation. For all intents and purposes, MazdaSpeed is a very, very, very reputable brand. For historical context, MazdaSpeed has always been a part of the brand ever since the 60s. And so it was originally conceived as a small concept and just something to be thinking about. You know, nobody really took that seriously. But over time, and with many, many more wins in both racing and in performance, Mazda slowly began to develop and believe in the concept. In between that time, right around 1970s, 1980s, there was a little thing that happened, but I won't get into that just yet. The MazdaSpeed brand, for many of us, is considered to be one of the purest forms of joy from a Japanese sports brand. In terms of style and performance, the MazdaSpeed line really takes it up a notch. And so getting into it, the MazdaSpeed 3 was probably one of the most unseen things. And over time, the Mazda Sports Corner would eventually evolve into basically their pedigree of performance. Now, there were apparently some earlier renditions of MazdaSpeed, which began with the Protege, because the 3, which we're going to be talking about today, began itself as the Protege, and really earlier the 323. And so the MazdaSpeed situation really didn't become a thing up until 2003 with the MazdaSpeed Protege, which was the first mass-produced North American MazdaSpeed lineup. Now, getting into the good, right? So we all know about the MazdaSpeed 3, and there were 2 generations from 2007 to 2013. They both bore the 2.3 liter turbo and eventually would get up to 263 horsepower with a monstrous amount of torque at 280 pound-feet, and it offered a lot of value for what it was. Now, I have personally never had a MazdaSpeed 3. I actually have had several Civic SIs, but I could not dare touch a MazdaSpeed 3 with my Civic Si because the power was simply not there. What made the MazdaSpeed different as opposed to many of the other cars was that it offered a lot of funk. I mean, the torque, the tires were getting roasted every time you stomped your foot into the gas pedal and let off the clutch. It was that amazing. Howsoever, MazdaSpeed 3 is kind of synonymous with boy racer, and that is going to get a bit into the problem. So here's the thing, as a little retrospective, back in the early 70s, Ford decided that they were going to take stake of Mazda as a product of the gas crisis of 73, and Mazda was having some real hard times trying to keep up paying the bills. So Ford, being the benevolent American capitalist company that they are, swooped in and made an agreement where they would take over stake in Mazda and eventually would use them as a vehicle to help build more small, efficient, quality vehicles, as the Americans had a real hard time trying to do that for obvious reasons, because here in America, we like really big, bulky cars. But the partnership between Mazda and between Ford would eventually lead into some really great products, and one of them being the Mazda Protege, as well as the Ford Focus, as well as the Ford Escort. The small cars was kind of Mazda's bread and butter, but unfortunately with Ford, there were a lot of restrictions and a lot of boundaries that were being set, because obviously Ford had enough stake to be able to say so. Well, towards 1997, that's where we really begin to see a different level of control with Ford, as they begin to buy more stake because of the Asia crisis of 1997. The thing is that whenever we have a crisis, it's a crisis for everybody. And so because it's a crisis, in many cases, if you are really good at what you do, this is the perfect time to acquire any type of company that is in knee deep. It was kind of messy when I was looking at it, but the Ford Motor Company decided that they were going to invest more shares and stake in Mazda and begin to co-develop some different type of cars for future development. One of the things that they developed alongside Volvo was the C1 platform. The C1 platform was co-developed between Mazda, Ford, and Volvo, as they had a meeting of the minds in Germany to really understand what was going on with their global platform, because apparently they all discovered they was doing different. There was a lot of disagreement and a lot of misunderstanding, and eventually Mazda, Ford, and Volvo would all come to understand that in order to make a global platform that was aligned with all of their needs, they were going to have to make some compromises. But the C1 platform was co-developed between Volvo, Ford, as well as Mazda, to give a unique and globally aligned platform as they distribute it amongst the network. But the thing is that the C1 platform was suitable and perfect for the development of the MazdaSpeed3. So shortly after the C1 platform was developed, we began to see a bit of tailoring and transformation from the Ford Motor Company in all of the subsidiaries, because at the time, Ford had several different people under its umbrella. One of them being Volvo, another being Mazda, Jaguar, Land Rover, as well as Aston Martin, as well as Lincoln. So there was like a whole bunch of people under one network, and it was very common for many of the American companies to have different names and numbers under their brands. We even see that today with Stellantis. And so as a result of that C1 platform, some really good things came out of that. One of them being the Ford Focus, but also being the Mazda 3. Now the Mazda 3 was developed on the C1 platform and was a success in the United States. The thing that made the Mazda 3 really special was that you got the Japanese pedigree, but you also got the American pricing. Now the problem with the Mazda 3 at the time was that the Mazda 3 was a little on the cheap side in terms of interior, and some people felt as though it was a parts bin throwaway of the Ford Focus. Now the Ford Focus by no means is no slouch. If you haven't seen my video about the Ford Focus and its success in Europe, go check that out. But more importantly, the faulty transmissions, because baby, that was falling out. But fast forward into 4 years later, after its debut in 2003, the MazdaSpeed3 would come about. Now the MazdaSpeed3 is low-key a parts bin, let's keep it a buck. And so the thing about the MazdaSpeed3 is that when it initially launched in 2007, it was truly a work of art. So there's argument whether or not the MazdaSpeed3 carried a Duratec engine, but it's true. It was a 2.3 liter Duratec engine that had some minor tweaks that was basically co-developed with Mazda, and it pumped out a massive 263 horsepower. And the first generation, unlike the second generation, came from a 2.3 liter engine that was derived from the MazdaSpeed6, unlike the second generation, which derived its version, as the Mazda 6 had been discontinued, from the CX-90. But nonetheless, either generation was absolutely phenomenal. There was no car, with the exception of the Volkswagen R32, that could really touch this. Even the GTI had a very hard time keeping up with this car. But the thing is that the MazdaSpeed3 represented that you could indeed make a hot hat much more attainable, as it had a starting price roughly around $23,000 to $24,000. The unfortunate thing is that both the first generation and the second generation did not make a very long time, which gets me into the point of this video. So in between that time, between 1997 and 2008, there was a little bit of thing that happened. So in the earlier stages, before the C1 platform was developed, Ford, as I said earlier, had really increased their stakes to be able to take more control over Mazda. And we all know, like we saw with Daimler Chrysler, there's nothing worse than somebody telling you what the to do. And as the time went on, we began to see Ford becoming to make more and more demands and creating more situations for Mazda to create and develop these cars that wouldn't perform as well, but on the Ford side would perform even better because of the name recognition. And so towards 2008 is where we begin to see the housing crisis. Now, hold on. We have been through essentially 3 crises as the course of the story. There is the gas crisis of 73, there is the Asian crisis of 1997, and there is the housing crisis of 2008. Are you seeing a trend here? And so around 2008, this would be the perfect opportunity for Mazda to seek its liberation from Ford. Shortly thereafter, Ford was in some real trouble as the housing crisis pretty much caused the big 3 to really be in a bit of a pickle. And by pickle, I mean broke. In order to make a desperate attempt to be able to keep themselves afloat, Ford did a bold move, and that was to sell its shares back to Mazda. Now, in this agreement, it was decided that they would continue to be able to operate as normal with some minor agreements, and they would co-share some different cars as we know them to have done for years and years. But this is where it gets sticky. The reason why the MazdaSpeed3 had to go, because it not only was representative of what Ford had done in the past, but more importantly, it was a representation that Mazda could do its own thing without anybody telling it what to do. Now, fast forward into 2012, 2013, the MazdaSpeed3 would be discontinued. Of course, one of the biggest complaints about it is that it had way too much torque, as the torque steer apparently was really that big of a deal, but anybody who's driven front wheel drive cars knows that torque steer is always going to be a problem. Nonetheless, the MazdaSpeed3 at its core was pure performance, but it had to go. Towards 2014, we would see a new generation of the Mazda 3 with no Mazda Speed iteration. 2016, fans had been clamoring for the Mazda Speed 3 to be able to be available to the public, and Mazda basically said, F off. In their attempt to becoming a more premium brand, the Bracer Boy image didn't quite translate well. By comparison, you also had the Ford Focus ST and the RS, which were the American equivalents of what the MazdaSpeed3 used to be. But the difference is that Ford has a luxury brand as opposed to Mazda, who is basically a niche Japanese sports brand. And so in the attempt to be able to move up market, consumers have a very hard time separating sports from luxury. And while they don't call themselves a luxury brand, that's who they're aiming after. And the MazdaSpeed3 is the antithesis of premium. Considering how much power it has and considering how much potency it has in terms of performance, aftermarkets, and basically enthusiasm amongst the car community, it is very difficult for Mazda to be able to concisely put those things together. Now, shortly thereafter, they would later reintroduce Mazda, as there would be a turbocharged Mazda 6, as well as a turbocharged Mazda 3, as well as turbocharged. Howsoever, none of them have ever had Mazda Speed up until this point, because the recognition from what we know Mazda Speed back in 2010, 2009, whatever you want to call it, is a complete departure of what Mazda would like to be recognized to today. And so the real problem with the MazdaSpeed3 and why they won't bring it back and why it was discontinued, simply because it did not fit the direction of where Mazda was trying to go. Now, in my honest opinion, I do believe that Mazda is making a huge mistake with the car community, because it is absolutely crazy where many of us car community enthusiasts are going, especially when you see there's various cars such as the Civic Si with 200 horsepower but still a hoot to drive. There's also the Integra Type S, various cars such as the SRT Hellcat, the Ford Mustang Dark Horse, as well as the Golf R, and just the capability and pushing of these cars. Even the Tesla Plaid Performance got some level of car enthusiasts. And so Mazda tried to reintroduce the Mazda 3 with the turbo hatchback to it just did not have that same level of spunk and spontaneity. If you are in the market for one, the thing is to remember they had huge oil consumption issues, and unfortunately that's just something that comes along with having a high output turbocharged engine. But nonetheless, finding a really good MazdaSpeed3 in good condition is incredibly difficult, as many of the aftermarket has pretty much clap them out. Now, Mazda has announced at one point or another that they would be looking at, considering bringing MazdaSpeed back, but it would literally be a trim line with no underlying specs, and we have no clue what's going on. And it's been very hush-hush as of 2024 of this year. And I would go on to argue that the MazdaSpeed lineup as a trim has always been a thing, but more importantly, giving it a chassis tuning as well as some bigger tires and a bigger wing is not the MazdaSpeed 3 that we remember, and probably will not take as well as the one that it did back in the early 2000s. So in turn, while the MazdaSpeed 3 is a love letter to auto enthusiast performance, it is one of those cars that had to go. And if you are in the market for MazdaSpeed 3, I would just recommend that you probably shoot for the Mazda 3 turbo hatchback with the 2.5, because that is as good as it's gonna get. But I would love to hear your comments about this, because I'm very curious to know what you guys think about the MazdaSpeed 3, as well as if you've ever had one, but more importantly, should they bring it back, because it seems as though. And with that being said, until the next video, I will see you guys later.